At the office, everyone feared him. The billionaire CEO's name was enough to silence a room, freeze smiles, and lower eyes. But I'm the janitor who stood up to him and made him red-faced with shame. Maybe you're finishing your rounds, checking the cameras, or closing the building while the world sleeps. Tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? I promise, today's story will touch your heart. My name is Martha, and for 23 years, I've been the invisible woman in the Winton Financial Tower on North Michigan Avenue in Chicago. Every morning at 5, while the city still dreams, I push through those heavy glass doors carrying my cart of cleaning supplies, my keys jangling like wind chimes in the pre-dawn silence. The security guard barely looks up from his newspaper, just a quick nod to acknowledge I exist, which is more than most people in this building ever gave me. I wear the same faded blue uniform every day, sleeves permanently rolled up, my hands rough and cracked from years of scrubbing marble floors that cost more per square foot than most people make in a month. My reflection in those polished surfaces always startled me. A woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, eyes that have seen too much and said too little. Richard Winton III owned this tower, along with half of downtown Chicago's skyline. His wealth was the kind that made headlines in Forbes magazine. Hundreds of millions tied up in real estate investments, stock portfolios that shifted like the weather, and rumors of cryptocurrency holdings that could buy small countries. Bitcoin wallets worth more than entire pension funds. Assets scattered across continents like seeds from a money tree that never stopped growing. But money, I learned, doesn't buy you decency. The first time I saw him up close was on a Tuesday morning in October. I was buffing the 42nd floor when the elevator doors opened with that soft ding that announced important arrivals. Out stepped Richard Winton in a suit that probably cost more than my annual salary, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the floor I'd spent 2 hours perfecting. He didn't see me, people like him never do, but I saw everything about him. The way he carried himself like he owned not just the building, but the air inside it. The platinum Rolex that caught the morning light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. The cell phone pressed against his ear as he barked orders about dividend payments and quarterly returns. "I don't care if the market's volatile," he snapped into the phone, walking past me like I was furniture. "Move 50 million from the European holdings into gold futures. Do it now." 50 million. Said as casually as I might mention buying milk at the grocery store. That's when I knew I was working in a different world, one where my monthly struggles to pay rent wouldn't even register as a rounding error in his daily calculations. But what I didn't know yet was how deeply his world would wound mine, how systematically it would strip away pieces of my dignity until I almost forgot I'd ever had any. You see, I wasn't always invisible. Back in Peoria, where I grew up, people knew my name. I was Martha Sullivan, the girl who helped her mother run the church bake sales, who married young and dreamed of a house with a white picket fence and children laughing in the backyard. Life had other plans. My husband left when our daughter Emma was 3, disappearing like smoke with promises to send money that never came. Suddenly, I was a single mother in a small town with limited opportunities and unlimited bills. Chicago beckoned like a distant lighthouse. The big city meant jobs, possibilities, a chance to build something for Emma and me. I packed our few belongings into a rusted Plymouth and drove east with hope in my heart and $63 in my purse. The janitor position at Winton Financial wasn't glamorous, but it offered steady work, health insurance, and the promise of overtime pay. What it didn't promise was dignity. But I was too desperate to read the fine print on that particular contract. Emma grew up in a cramped one-bedroom apartment in Humboldt Park, while I worked nights in a gleaming tower that represented everything we couldn't have. She did homework at the kitchen table while I was 40 floors up, emptying trash cans filled with discarded investment reports worth more than our yearly income. She made friends I never met, went to school events I couldn't attend, celebrated birthdays while I scrubbed conference rooms where men discussed their third vacation homes. The guilt ate at me slowly, like rust on old metal. Every missed recital, every bedtime story replaced by a hurried phone call from the office, every "mommy has to work tonight" carved another small wound in my heart. But I told myself it was temporary. I was building something for us. Tomorrow would be different. 23 years later, tomorrow still hasn't come. The night shifts at Winton Financial started at 6 p.m. and ended whenever the work was done, usually around 3 in the morning. The building transformed after business hours. The urgent energy of trading floors gave way to an eerie quiet, broken only by the hum of ventilation systems and the distant rumble of late-night traffic on Michigan Avenue. This was when I truly inhabited their world, moving through spaces where millions of dollars changed hands daily, where decisions were made that could affect thousands of lives. I learned to read the building's moods through its debris. When the stock market had a good day, the trash cans overflowed with champagne bottles and takeout containers from expensive restaurants. Bad days meant stress-eating evidence, empty coffee cups by the dozen, antacid packets, crumpled newspaper clippings about market volatility. The recycling bins told stories of fortunes won and lost in the space between morning coffee and afternoon meetings. Richard Winton's personal office occupied the entire top floor, a testament to wealth that bordered on obscene. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings. Persian rugs that belonged in museums covered polished hardwood floors. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Chicago's skyline, with Lake Michigan stretching toward the horizon like a promise of escape. His desk was the size of my kitchen table, made from what looked like a single piece of mahogany that probably cost more than most people's cars. Investment reports scattered across its surface detailed holdings that read like a geography lesson. Petroleum interests in Texas, tech stocks in Silicon Valley, real estate ventures in Manhattan, and offshore accounts in places I couldn't pronounce. Numbers with so many zeros they looked like telephone numbers. But what struck me most wasn't the wealth itself. It was how carelessly it was treated. Stock certificates worth millions tossed in the trash after acquisitions. Dividend checks for hundreds of thousands of dollars left lying on side tables like forgotten grocery lists. Once, I found a cashier's check for $2 million being used as a bookmark in a novel he'd apparently abandoned after 3 chapters. $2 million. As a bookmark. I thought about that check while riding the bus home that morning, watching the sun rise over neighborhoods where families struggled to pay medical bills, where seniors chose between prescription medications and groceries. The disconnect was so profound, it felt like living in 2 different countries that happened to share the same zip code. Emma was 15 when I first started questioning whether the sacrifice was worth it. She'd grown into a beautiful teenager with my stubborn chin and her father's dark eyes, but there was a distance between us that couldn't be measured in miles. When I asked about her day, she'd shrug and say, "Fine," before retreating to her room. When I tried to help with homework, she'd politely decline, already having figured out solutions on her own. She was growing up to be self-sufficient out of necessity, and while I was proud of her strength, I mourned the childhood independence had stolen from her. The parent-teacher conferences were the hardest, sitting in tiny plastic chairs designed for much smaller people, listening to teachers praise Emma's intelligence and maturity while carefully avoiding questions about why her mother worked nights and slept most afternoons. Other parents chatted about soccer practices and piano lessons, creating a tapestry of normal family life that Emma and I observed from the outside. "She's very responsible," Mrs. Patterson, her English teacher, told me during one particularly painful conference. "Sometimes I worry she's too serious for a girl her age. Does she have friends? Hobbies?" I wanted to explain that hobbies required time and money we didn't have, that friends meant play dates and birthday parties that conflicted with my work schedule. Instead, I smiled and nodded and promised to encourage more social activities, knowing it was another promise I probably couldn't keep. The holidays were especially brutal. While Richard Winton's office filled with expensive flower arrangements and gift baskets from grateful clients, Emma and I celebrated Christmas with a small artificial tree from Walgreens and presents purchased during post-holiday clearance sales the year before. She never complained, but I saw her watching other kids with their new bikes and gaming systems, their faces bright with the particular joy that comes from having parents who can afford spontaneity. I started picking up extra shifts wherever possible, cleaning offices in other buildings on weekends, taking on special projects that paid overtime rates. The money helped, but it meant less time with Emma, less presence in her daily life. I was working harder to give her more while simultaneously giving her less of what she actually needed, me. The breaking point came during her junior year of high school. She'd been accepted to Northwestern University with a partial academic scholarship, but the remaining tuition costs were still astronomical. I spent sleepless nights calculating and recalculating our finances, robbing Peter to pay Paul, and discovering that even robbing everyone still left us short. That's when I made the decision that would haunt me for years afterward. I went to Richard Winton's office one evening, not as the invisible janitor, but as a desperate mother. I knocked on his door during one of his late-night sessions, my hands shaking as I held Emma's acceptance letter and financial aid forms. He looked up from his computer with the expression of someone who'd found an unexpected insect in his salad. "Yes? What is it?" "Mr. Winton, I'm Martha Sullivan. I clean your offices." His gaze slid over me without recognition, even though I'd been maintaining his workspace for over a decade. "And?" The words tumbled out in a rush of desperation and hope. I told him about Emma, about her scholarship, about the gap we couldn't bridge. I wasn't asking for charity, I explained. I was wondering if there might be additional work available, special projects, anything that could help us reach our goal. He listened with the patience of someone waiting for an elevator, checking his watch twice during my stumbling presentation. When I finished, he leaned back in his leather chair and studied me with eyes that held no malice, no kindness, just complete indifference. "Ms. Sullivan, Martha Sullivan." "Right, Ms. Sullivan. I'm sure your daughter's very bright, but I'm not in the business of funding other people's dreams. Perhaps she should consider community college first, work her way up. Character building, you understand." Character building. As if Emma hadn't been building character every day of her life, learning to be independent because her mother was busy building his fortune while neglecting her own child's needs. I left his office with my pride in tatters and my hope extinguished. Emma would attend Northwestern. We'd find a way, even if it meant crushing debt and more years of sacrifice. But something inside me broke that night. Something that had been cracking for years finally split wide open. The worst part wasn't his refusal. It was his assumption that Emma should settle for less simply because we came from less. In his world, education was a given, opportunity was inherited, and success was a family tradition. In our world, they were luxuries to be earned through decades of exhaustion and compromise. Do you know what it's like to work in a place where your annual salary wouldn't cover their monthly wine budget? Where your deepest struggles are their rounding errors? I'm asking because I see you there, watching the story unfold, and I wonder if you felt that particular kind of invisible. That specific humiliation of needing something from people who have forgotten what needing feels like. The indignities came in waves after that, small tsunamis of disrespect that left me feeling waterlogged with shame. Richard Winton began acknowledging my existence, but only to point out supposed deficiencies in my work. A water spot on his conference table became grounds for a 10-minute lecture about attention to detail. Dust on a bookshelf that no one ever read led to suggestions that perhaps I was getting too old for this type of work. His executive assistant, Caroline, was even worse, a woman in her 30s who'd parlayed a business degree and strategic flirtation into a 6-figure salary. She treated me like a malfunctioning appliance that couldn't be bothered to fix itself. She'd leave passive-aggressive notes about cleaning standards, schedule meetings in rooms I'd just finished mopping, and speak about me in third person even when I was standing right there. I don't think she understands how important these surfaces are. Caroline told Richard one evening while I was cleaning nearby. Maybe we need someone with more attention to detail. Someone younger, she meant. Someone cheaper. Someone more grateful for the privilege of being invisible. The financial pressure at home was becoming unbearable. Emma's tuition payments stretched our budget beyond its breaking point. I was eating one meal a day to make ends meet, surviving on coffee and determination, while watching my daughter excel academically and pretend not to notice her mother was slowly disappearing from overwork and undernourishment. I started picking up shifts at other buildings, cleaning banks and law offices until my hands cracked and bled from constant exposure to harsh chemicals. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. I'd catch 20-minute naps between buildings, dozing in bus stops and bathroom stalls, dreaming of a day when rest wouldn't feel like laziness. The health problems started small: persistent headaches, joint pain that made climbing stairs an ordeal, a cough that lingered for months. But doctors and medicine cost money we didn't have, so I treated symptoms with over-the-counter pills and prayer, hoping my body would hold together long enough to get Emma through college. One night in December, while cleaning Richard Winton's office, I found investment statements scattered across his desk. The numbers were staggering: personal wealth that exceeded small countries' GDP, capital gains that dwarfed my lifetime earnings, dividend payments that arrived monthly like clockwork. One particular statement caught my eye: a cryptocurrency investment that had appreciated by $12 million in a single quarter. $12 million. In 3 months. From doing absolutely nothing. I sat down in his chair, the first time I'd ever presumed such a liberty, and stared at those numbers until they blurred together. $12 million was enough to pay Emma's tuition for the next century. It was enough to buy our apartment building and every building on our block. It was enough to fund scholarships for hundreds of kids like Emma, kids whose mothers were slowly killing themselves to afford dreams they had already been denied. And it was profit, money earned from money, multiplication without effort, wealth breeding more wealth like some kind of financial bacteria that grew exponentially in the petri dish of American capitalism. The contrast was so stark, it felt like physical pain. While I was rationing meals and postponing medical care, Richard Winton was making more money in his sleep than I'd make in 10 lifetimes of 60-hour weeks. While Emma was calculating loan payments that would follow her into middle age, his children were probably debating which European university offered the best skiing nearby. That's when the anger started, not the hot explosive kind that burns bright and fades quickly, but the cold, steady fury that settles into your bones and changes the way you see everything. For 23 years, I'd been grateful for this job. Grateful for steady work, grateful for health insurance, grateful for the opportunity to serve people who had so much that they'd forgotten the value of having anything. But gratitude, I realized, had become another form of invisibility. My thankfulness for scraps from their table had made me complicit in my own diminishment. By being grateful for less, I'd taught them to give me even less than that. The revelation was both liberating and terrifying. If I wasn't grateful, what was I? If I wasn't invisible, who would I become? After 2 decades of defining myself through service to others, the prospect of existing for my own sake felt like stepping off a cliff into darkness. But Emma was watching. Even when she pretended not to notice my exhaustion, even when she acted like financial stress was normal. She was learning how to be a woman from watching me. And I realized with crystal clarity that I was teaching her to apologize for existing, to be grateful for scraps, to make herself smaller so other people could feel bigger. That couldn't be my legacy. That couldn't be her inheritance. The opportunity for change came, ironically, through the very carelessness that characterized their wealth. I was emptying Richard Winton's trash one evening when I found documents he'd obviously meant to shred, financial records from an international investment firm, correspondence about offshore accounts, tax strategies that seemed to dance along the very edge of legality. Most of it was beyond my understanding, complex financial instruments with names like derivatives and hedge fund partnerships that might as well have been written in ancient Greek. But some pieces were crystal clear, written in the universal language of numbers that transcend education levels and social classes. Tax avoidance schemes that saved him millions annually, while teachers and firefighters paid higher effective rates than he did. Investment strategies that profited from housing market collapses that left families homeless. Profit margins on properties where families like mine struggled to afford rent while he collected passive income that could fund small cities. It was all legal, technically, immoral and socially destructive, but perfectly legal. The kind of legal that requires armies of lawyers and accountants to maintain, the kind that's available only to people whose wealth provides access to complexity the rest of us can't navigate or afford. I photographed the documents with my outdated phone, not from any grand plan, but from some instinct I couldn't quite name. Maybe it was insurance, maybe it was evidence, maybe it was just proof that the games they played with numbers had real consequences for real people. What I didn't realize was that those photographs would become the foundation of my liberation. The confrontation came 3 weeks later on a Thursday evening that started like any other. I was cleaning the boardroom where Richard Winton had spent the afternoon in meetings with his financial advisors, discussing investment strategies and tax positions. The room still smelled like expensive cigars and entitlement. Caroline appeared in the doorway with her usual expression of barely contained disdain. "Martha, Mr. Winton wants to see you in his office." My stomach clenched with familiar anxiety. Late-night summons to his office usually meant complaints about my work, subtle threats about replacement, reminders of my expendability. I followed Caroline down the hallway like a prisoner walking toward execution, my cleaning cart squeaking behind me like a soundtrack to my humiliation. Richard Winton was sitting behind his massive desk, studying financial reports with the concentration of a general planning military strategy. He didn't look up when I entered, leaving me standing awkwardly in the doorway like a child waiting to be disciplined. "You've been here a long time, Martha," he said finally, still not meeting my eyes. 23 years, Mr. Winton." 23 years. He repeated the number like he was tasting wine, considering its vintage. That's quite an investment of time. Investment. Everything was transactional to him, even human relationships measured in terms of return on capital. "I've been thinking about efficiency lately," he continued, finally looking up from his papers. "Cost-benefit analysis, return on investment, that sort of thing." My hands gripped the handle of my cart so tight my knuckles went white. This was the conversation I'd been dreading for months, the one where my age became a liability, where my years of service became a reason for dismissal rather than respect. "I wondered if you might be happier somewhere else," he said with the tone of someone offering a gift. "Somewhere with less demanding standards. Sometimes people outgrow their positions, you understand. It's nothing personal." Nothing personal. As if 23 years of my life, of Emma's childhood sacrificed to his comfort, of dignity traded for steady employment, could be dismissed as impersonal business decision. Something inside me snapped, not broke, but snapped into focus like a camera lens finding perfect clarity after years of blurriness. I thought about Emma, about the woman I was teaching her to become through my example. I thought about the photographs hidden in my locker, about the millions of dollars sitting in offshore accounts while families like mine struggled to survive. I thought about being grateful for scraps from tables I'd set and cleaned and maintained for over 2 decades. "Mr. Winton," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, "before we discuss my future here, I think we should talk about yours." He looked confused, as if the furniture had suddenly started speaking. "I'm sorry?" I reached into my uniform pocket and pulled out my phone, scrolling to the photographs I'd taken of his discarded financial documents. His confusion transformed into alarm as he recognized his own letterhead, his own signature, his own carefully concealed financial maneuvering displayed on my cracked phone screen. "These are interesting reading," I said, still marveling at the steadiness of my own voice, especially the parts about tax liability and offshore holdings. I imagine the IRS would find them educational. The color drained from his face like water from a broken dam. Richard Winton, master of the universe, multimillionaire manipulator of markets and men, suddenly looked like what he was under all that armor of wealth and privilege. A frightened man who'd built his fortune on foundations that couldn't withstand scrutiny. Those are private documents. Taking photographs is theft. Is it? I tilted my head, considering. Because they were in the trash. Abandoned property, I think the lawyers call it. Amazing what people throw away when they think no one's watching. His fingers drummed against the desk, calculation replacing panic in his eyes. What do you want? What did I want? 23 years of accumulated grievances rose in my throat like bile. Respect, recognition, fairness, dignity. An apology for every slight, every dismissal, every moment he'd made me feel less than human. But mostly, I wanted him to understand what it felt like to be powerless, to have your fate decided by someone who saw you as expendable. I want my job, I said simply. I want my benefits. I want the respect that comes with 23 years of dedicated service. And I want a raise, a significant one, backdated to cover the cost of living increases I should have received years ago. And if I refuse, then I think several government agencies would be very interested in these documents. The IRS, the SEC, maybe some congressional committees that focus on tax avoidance by wealthy individuals. I imagine the media would find them fascinating too. We stared at each other across his massive desk, predator and prey roles suddenly reversed. For the first time in our long relationship, Richard Winton truly saw me, not as invisible help, not as expendable labor, but as a person with power that could affect his life. The negotiation lasted 2 hours. A raise that doubled my salary, guaranteed health benefits, a college fund contribution for Emma that would eliminate our crushing debt. Most importantly, a written contract that protected me from retaliatory firing. But money wasn't the real victory. The real victory was watching the most powerful person I'd ever known realize that everyone, absolutely everyone, is vulnerable to someone. That wealth is not armor against consequences. That privilege can't protect you from every form of accountability. When I walked out of his office that night, my cart squeaking down the marble hallway one last time before my new responsibilities began, I felt like I was breathing different air. Not cleaner air, the building still smelled like money and moral compromise, but air that belonged to me, that I had a right to breathe. Emma was awake when I got home at 5 in the morning, sitting at our kitchen table with textbooks spread around her like artifacts of her approaching freedom. She looked up when I walked in, and something in my face made her set down her pen. "Mom, are you okay? You look different." I sat down across from her and told her everything about the confrontation, about the photographs, about the contract I'd signed that would change both our lives. Her eyes grew wide as the story unfolded, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long time. "You blackmailed him," she said finally, and I couldn't tell if she was shocked or impressed. "I negotiated," I corrected, "from a position of strength instead of weakness. There's a difference." She nodded slowly, and I could see her processing not just the events but what they meant for how she understood her mother, her world, the relationship between power and justice. "I'm proud of you," she said, and I realized it was the first time she'd said those words to me instead of me saying them to her. The changes at Winton Financial were immediate and obvious. Richard Winton treated me with wary respect, like someone who'd learned to handle live explosives. Caroline's passive-aggressive notes disappeared completely, whether from direct orders or from her own survival instincts. I never knew. My new salary allowed me to work normal hours, to eat regular meals, to take Emma to dinner at restaurants where the waitstaff weren't also students working their way through school. But the most profound change was internal. I walked differently, not with the careful invisibility of someone trying not to disturb important people, but with the confident stride of someone who belonged in whatever space she occupied. I spoke up in meetings I'd previously attended silently. I made suggestions about efficiency improvements based on my intimate knowledge of the building's operations. I asserted expertise I'd been accumulating for over 2 decades. Some people adapted better than others to my transformation. The security guards, who'd always treated me with casual respect, simply nodded their approval at my new status. The other cleaning staff looked at me with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment. How had their invisible colleague suddenly become visible, powerful, protected? The executive staff struggled more with the change. Years of treating me as human furniture don't reverse quickly, and several of them seemed genuinely confused by my sudden transformation from service provider to colleague. Board meetings where I'd once emptied trash cans silently now included my input on operational matters. Emma's transformation was equally remarkable. The financial pressure that had shadowed her entire adolescence lifted like fog burning off in morning sunlight. She joined clubs, made friends, went to movies without calculating the cost in foregone groceries. Her grades, already excellent, improved further as stress stopped interfering with her concentration. But more importantly, she started seeing her mother differently. Not as a victim of circumstances, not as a cautionary tale about limited options, but as a woman who'd found power in an impossible situation and used it to change her life. The ripple effects extended beyond our family. Emma's friends, most of whom came from similar working-class backgrounds, watched our story with fascination. Their own mothers, hotel housekeepers, office cleaners, restaurant workers, began asking questions about their own situations, their own rights, their own accumulated knowledge that might have value beyond their current positions. One evening, Emma brought home her friend Maria, whose mother cleaned offices in the Loop. Over dinner, Maria peppered me with questions about documentation, about legal protections, about the difference between being grateful for employment and accepting exploitation. "My mom's been doing the same job for 15 years, Maria said, her voice tight with anger I recognized. They've never given her a raise, never acknowledged her experience. She knows more about their business operations than half their managers, but they treat her like she's disposable." I found myself becoming an accidental consultant to an underground network of invisible women, cleaners and caregivers and food service workers who'd spent decades making other people's lives run smoothly while their own fell apart from neglect. They came to me for advice, for courage, for examples of how knowledge could become leverage and leverage could become justice. The conversations happened in break rooms and bus stops, in late-night text messages and Sunday afternoon phone calls, women sharing stories of disrespect, of exploitation, of the small daily humiliations that accumulate into life-altering damage, but also sharing strategies, legal resources, documentation techniques, and most importantly, the radical idea that their experience had value that went far beyond their assigned tasks. Some of these women found their own versions of leverage, child care workers who documented safety violations that wealthy parents preferred to ignore, house cleaners who'd overheard investment strategies and business plans while being treated as furniture, administrative assistants who'd been handling complex operations while being paid as if they were filing clerks. Others simply found the courage to ask for what they deserved: raises, respect, recognition for expertise they'd been providing for free. Not all succeeded, but all discovered that asking was possible, that their voices had value even when the answers disappointed them. The movement, if it could be called that, was invisible to the people it affected most. The wealthy executives and professionals who employed this army of invisible women never realized that their careless treatment of workers had created an underground network of knowledge and mutual support. They continued to discuss sensitive business matters in front of people they didn't consider worth noticing, continued to discard documents that revealed the gap between their public personas and private practices. But the women noticed everything. They communicated through channels their employers couldn't access or monitor. They shared information and strategies across industries and office buildings, creating a shadow economy of mutual aid and collective empowerment. My own situation continued to improve. The raise Richard Winton had agreed to was substantial enough that I could afford not just basic necessities, but small luxuries that had been unimaginable for decades. A new winter coat that wasn't from a thrift store, dinner at a restaurant where I was a customer instead of watching other people eat while I cleaned their tables, books bought new instead of borrowed from the library. Emma's college education, once a source of crushing financial anxiety, became a celebration of possibility. She changed her major from business, a practical choice motivated by our financial limitations, to environmental science, following a passion she'd never felt free to pursue. Her grades reflected not just intelligence, but the joy that comes from studying something you love instead of something you think you should. But the most meaningful change was in our relationship. The financial stress that had created distance between us, my exhaustion, her independence born of necessity, began to heal. We had time for conversations that weren't about logistics or survival. We discovered shared interests in old movies and terrible reality TV shows. We developed inside jokes and traditions that had nothing to do with making ends meet. One evening, about 6 months after my confrontation with Richard Winton, Emma and I were walking along Lake Michigan, watching the sunset paint the water in shades of gold and pink. The city skyline sparkled behind us, including the Winton Financial Tower where I'd spent so many years of invisible servitude. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked suddenly. "The way things happened, I mean." The blackmail? I thought about the question seriously. Did I regret using Richard Winton's own carelessness against him? Did I regret forcing accountability from someone who'd built his fortune on avoiding consequences? "I regret that it was necessary," I said finally. "I regret that 23 years of dedicated service wasn't enough to earn basic respect. I regret that I had to find leverage instead of being given fairness. But I don't regret standing up for myself, for us, for the principle that every person deserves dignity, regardless of their job title." She nodded, and we walked in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the waves lap against the shore. "I want to be like you," she said eventually, "strong like that, brave enough to fight when fighting is necessary." "You already are," I told her, and I meant it. Emma had been fighting her entire life, fighting to excel academically despite financial stress, fighting to maintain optimism despite limited options, fighting to become the person she wanted to be instead of the person circumstances tried to force her to become. The year passed quickly. Emma graduated summa cum laude and was accepted to graduate school with a full fellowship. Her research proposal on environmental justice had impressed the selection committee, and I suspected her personal essay about growing up in working-class Chicago had provided context that made her academic achievements even more remarkable. At her graduation ceremony, sitting in the audience at Northwestern University, I thought about all the moments I'd missed over the years, school plays and parent-teacher conferences, and teenage milestone celebrations postponed or skipped because of work obligations. This moment felt like compensation for all of them, a culmination that justified every sacrifice. But more than that, it felt like vindication of the choice I'd made to stop being invisible. Emma's success was her own achievement, but my transformation had created space for her to pursue dreams that seemed impossible when we were trapped in cycles of financial desperation and social invisibility. Richard Winton appeared at the graduation ceremony, along with other wealthy donors whose contributions funded various university programs. He saw me in the audience and nodded, not with warmth, but with the acknowledgement of someone who'd learned to respect an opponent. Our relationship had evolved into something like détente, wary mutual understanding based on clear boundaries and consequences. He'd never apologized for the years of disrespect, never acknowledged that his treatment of me had been wrong. But apologies weren't what I'd been seeking. What I'd wanted was change, and change had come. The aftermath of my transformation continued to ripple outward in ways I hadn't anticipated. News of my success spread through the network of invisible women who kept Chicago's offices running. Some tried to replicate my strategy exactly, looking for discarded documents and evidence of hypocrisy. Others found more creative approaches to asserting their value and demanding respect. Local news outlets began picking up stories about domestic workers and office cleaners who'd successfully negotiated better conditions. Labor organizers started reaching out to cleaning services and building maintenance companies, helping workers understand their rights and leverage their collective power. A sociology professor at the University of Chicago contacted me about participating in research on invisible labor and economic inequality. She was studying the experiences of women who performed essential work while remaining socially invisible, and she wanted to understand how some individuals managed to break through barriers that trapped others. The interviews were extensive and emotionally challenging. Talking about decades of disrespect and financial struggle required me to revisit painful memories I'd spent years trying to forget. But the professor helped me understand my experience in broader context, how individual stories of exploitation connected to systemic patterns of economic inequality and social invisibility. The research became part of a book about domestic and service workers in American cities, and my story became one chapter in a larger narrative about how economic desperation creates vulnerability that employers routinely exploit. Reading my experience in academic language was both validating and strange, seeing personal pain translated into theoretical frameworks and statistical analyses. But the most meaningful outcome was meeting other women whose stories paralleled mine. Through the research project, I connected with housekeepers and nannies and office workers from across the country who'd found their own ways to resist exploitation and demand dignity. Their strategies varied, but their core insight was the same. Invisibility is a choice that can be rejected, and leverage exists even in the most powerless-seeming situations. Emma, meanwhile, was thriving in graduate school. Her research on environmental justice in urban communities was gaining attention from policymakers and community organizations. She'd found her calling in work that combined scientific expertise with social activism, addressing the ways that environmental problems disproportionately affected working-class communities like the one where she'd grown up. Her success vindicated every choice I'd made, every risk I'd taken. The daughter who'd grown up watching her mother be invisible had become a young woman whose voice carried weight in academic and policy circles. The girl who'd learned self-reliance out of necessity had become a researcher whose work might help other families avoid the struggles that had defined our lives. But success, I learned, doesn't erase history. The years of financial stress had left psychological scars that healing slowly. Emma sometimes caught herself calculating costs for purchases she could easily afford, habits of scarcity that persisted despite changed circumstances. I found myself hoarding small luxuries, extra food, unused vacation days, money in savings accounts, as if abundance might disappear as suddenly as it had arrived. The trauma of invisibility took longer to heal than the trauma of poverty. Years of being ignored and dismissed had created reflexes of self-diminishment that required conscious effort to overcome. In meetings, I still sometimes waited for permission to speak, before remembering that my opinion had value regardless of whether anyone asked for it. In restaurants, I still felt surprised when servers treated me as a customer worthy of attention rather than someone to be processed efficiently. But healing was happening, slowly and imperfectly. Each day brought small victories over ingrained patterns of self-doubt and reflexive gratitude for basic respect. Each successful assertion of my worth made the next one easier. The 5-year anniversary of my confrontation with Richard Winton passed quietly. I marked it not with celebration, but with reflection on how completely my life had changed. The anxious, exhausted woman who'd spent decades apologizing for existing had evolved into someone who expected fairness and demanded dignity as basic rights rather than earned privileges. Emma was finishing her PhD and had accepted a position with the Environmental Protection Agency, where her research would directly influence policy affecting communities like the one where we'd struggled for so many years. Her work represented the possibility that individual transformation could contribute to systemic change, that personal liberation could serve broader justice. I was considering early retirement, not from financial necessity, but from the luxury of choice. My savings account, once non-existent, then minimal, now substantial, provided options that had been unimaginable during decades of paycheck-to-paycheck survival. I could choose work based on interest and values rather than desperation and debt. The irony wasn't lost on me that my security ultimately came from Richard Winton's wealth, redirected through a combination of leverage and justice rather than gratitude and charity. The money that had oppressed me for decades had become the foundation of my liberation, but only after I'd stopped being grateful for scraps and started demanding my fair share of the table. On a Tuesday evening in October, exactly 6 years after I'd first noticed Richard Winton walking past me like I was furniture, I was cleaning out my desk at Winton Financial, preparing for my last day of work. The building looked the same, but my relationship to it had been completely transformed. I was no longer the invisible woman who scrubbed their floors and emptied their trash cans. I'd become someone with a name, a voice, a presence that couldn't be ignored. Richard Winton appeared in the doorway of my office. I had an office now, with windows overlooking Michigan Avenue and furniture that belonged to me during business hours. He knocked before entering, a courtesy that would have been unthinkable during my decades of invisibility. "Martha," he said, and for the first time in our long relationship, my name sounded natural coming from his mouth. "I wanted to wish you well in your retirement." "Thank you, Mr. Winton." He stood awkwardly for a moment, clearly wanting to say something more, but struggling with words that didn't come naturally to him. Finally, he spoke again. "You know, this building ran more smoothly when you were cleaning it than it does now with the new service. They don't understand the systems the way you did." It was the closest thing to an acknowledgement of my expertise and value that he'd ever offered. Not an apology, not an admission of wrongdoing, but a recognition that my work had mattered in ways he'd never bothered to notice until it was gone. "Experience matters," I said simply, "in any job." He nodded and extended his hand for a handshake. His grip was firm but not dominating, the handshake of equals rather than employer and employee. When he left, I realized our relationship had evolved into something neither of us could have imagined when it began with his careless dismissal of my humanity. My last day at Winton Financial was anticlimactic in the best possible way. No drama, no confrontations, no final revelations or reversals. Just a normal day's work completed by someone who was ready to move on to the next chapter of her life. The other women in the building, cleaners and administrative staff and food service workers, threw me a small retirement party in the break room. We ate cake from the grocery store bakery and drank coffee from the machine that had sustained me through thousands of night shifts. Their gifts were modest but meaningful. A photo album filled with pictures from office parties I'd worked rather than attended, a plant for my apartment, a book about Chicago history written by people who'd noticed the invisible workers who'd built the city. Emma arrived as the party was ending, tall and confident in her EPA blazer, carrying flowers and wearing the smile that had sustained me through decades of doubt and struggle. She hugged me in front of my colleagues, and I realized she was proud to be seen as my daughter, not despite my job, but because of the dignity I'd brought to it. As we walked out of the Winton Financial building together, I thought about the woman who'd entered those doors 28 years earlier. Young, desperate, grateful for any opportunity, willing to be invisible in exchange for steady employment. She'd been strong in her own way, but her strength had been defensive, focused on survival rather than transformation. The woman leaving the building was different, still strong, but with strength that was assertive rather than enduring, transformative rather than merely surviving. She'd learned that invisibility was a choice, that respect was a right, that dignity belonged to everyone regardless of their position in someone else's hierarchy. Emma and I had dinner that night at a restaurant overlooking the lake, celebrating not just my retirement but the journey that had brought us both to this moment of possibility and choice. The lights of the city spread out below us, including the Winton Financial Tower where I'd spent so many years invisible and exhausted. "What's next?" Emma asked as we shared dessert and watched the sun set over water that reflected the light like scattered diamonds. I thought about the question seriously. What had come next for someone who'd spent most of her life serving other people's dreams, who'd finally created space for her own ambitions? "I don't know yet," I said honestly, "but for the first time in 30 years, I get to decide based on what I want instead of what I need. That feels like everything." The waiter brought our check, and I paid without calculating whether I could afford it, without weighing the cost against other necessities, without the anxiety that had accompanied every financial decision for decades. Small victories, but profound ones, for someone who remembered when buying groceries required choosing between items that all seemed essential. Walking home through downtown Chicago, past the buildings where invisible women were beginning their night shifts, I thought about all the stories that remained untold. How many janitors and housekeepers and food service workers were documenting, organizing, finding their voices, demanding dignity? How many daughters were watching their mothers transform from invisible to essential, learning that strength could be assertive rather than just enduring? The changes I'd experienced weren't just personal. They were part of larger transformations happening in cities across the country, as invisible workers discovered their power and used it to demand justice rather than charity, respect rather than gratitude, dignity as a right rather than a privilege. My story was ending, but it was also beginning. The woman who'd been invisible for so long was finally ready to be seen on her own terms, to use her voice for causes that mattered, to live the second half of her life as boldly as she'd lived the first half carefully. At home in my apartment, mortgage paid off early with my increased salary, renovated with money I'd earned rather than borrowed, I made tea and sat by the window overlooking the city. Somewhere out there, women were cleaning offices and caring for children and serving food, performing the essential work that kept everything else functioning while remaining largely invisible themselves. But visibility, I'd learned, was a choice. Recognition was something that could be demanded rather than waited for. Dignity belonged to everyone, and sometimes you had to fight for what was already yours. The phone rang. Another woman from another building, asking questions about documentation and leverage, and the courage required to stop being grateful for less than you deserved. I answered, ready to share what I'd learned, ready to help someone else discover that invisibility could be rejected and power could be claimed even from positions that seemed powerless. Outside my window, the city sparkled with lights from buildings where invisible people were making everything else possible. But increasingly, they weren't staying invisible. They were finding their voices, claiming their space, demanding their dignity. And that transformation, slow but inevitable, personal but collective, was perhaps the most valuable thing I'd helped create. Not just my own liberation, but a network of women who'd learned to see their own worth and fight for recognition that had been withheld too long. The story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. 3 years into my retirement, I received a call that would redirect my newfound freedom toward something I hadn't expected. The voice on the other end was young, nervous, speaking in rapid Spanish before switching to accented English. "Mrs. Sullivan? My name is Rosa Mendoza. Maria, Emma's friend. She gave me your number. I worked at the Millennium Tower downtown. I think I need help." I set down my morning coffee and gave Rosa my full attention. Her story poured out in fragments, 5 years cleaning offices in one of Chicago's most expensive buildings, watching her supervisor systematically underreport her hours to avoid paying overtime, witnessing safety violations that management ignored because proper ventilation systems would cost too much money. "They treat us like we don't exist," Rosa said, her voice breaking. "Like we're not people. Yesterday I asked about the health insurance they promised when they hired me. They said maybe I should look for work somewhere else if I'm not happy." The familiar anger rose in my chest, not the desperate fury of my own powerlessness, but the focused rage of someone who'd learned to channel indignation into action. Rosa's story was my story, repeated in another building with different players, but identical dynamics of exploitation and dismissal. "Rosa," I said, "can you meet me for lunch tomorrow? And bring any documentation you have, pay stubs, schedules, anything they've given you in writing." The next day, sitting across from Rosa in a small cafe near her apartment, I saw myself 20 years earlier. The same exhausted eyes, the same careful gratitude for basic acknowledgement, the same fear that speaking up would cost her the job that barely sustained her family. But unlike my younger self, Rosa had something I hadn't possessed during my decades of silence. She had me. Rosa's documentation revealed a pattern of wage theft that was both brazen and systematic. Hours shaved off time cards, overtime pay calculated incorrectly, health insurance premiums deducted from paychecks for coverage that didn't exist. The building management company was stealing from their most vulnerable employees because they could, because they assumed no one would question them, because they'd learned that desperation made people accept injustice as inevitable. "This is illegal," I told Rosa, spreading her pay stubs across the table between us. "Not just wrong, illegal. They're stealing from you, and there are laws that protect workers from exactly this kind of exploitation." Rosa's eyes filled with tears, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of being believed, of having someone with knowledge and experience validate that her treatment was unacceptable. "But what can I do? I need this job." "My children." "You keep the job," I said firmly, "and you get justice. These two things aren't mutually exclusive, despite what they want you to believe." Over the following weeks, I became Rosa's unofficial advocate and strategist. We documented everything. Photographed altered time cards, recorded conversations with supervisors, collected testimonies from other workers who'd experienced similar treatment. I taught Rosa about labor laws and workers' rights, about the difference between legal immigration status and workplace protections, about the resources available to employees who'd been systematically cheated. But most importantly, I helped Rosa understand that fighting back wasn't about anger or revenge. It was about dignity and justice, about refusing to let desperation make her complicit in her own exploitation. The case we built was rock solid. Wage theft affecting not just Rosa but dozens of other workers, safety violations that endangered employees and building occupants, tax evasion through underreported payroll expenses, insurance fraud involving phantom health coverage. The building management company had created a criminal enterprise disguised as legitimate business operations. Rosa filed complaints with the Department of Labor, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and the State Attorney General's office. Local news outlets picked up the story, drawn by the dramatic disparity between the luxury office building where executives worked and the systematic abuse of the workers who maintained it. The investigation moved quickly once authorities understood the scope of the violations. Rosa's documentation provided a roadmap that led investigators to evidence of similar schemes in other buildings managed by the same company. What started as one woman's complaint became a multi-million-dollar investigation into institutionalized wage theft affecting hundreds of workers. Rosa's employer settled out of court for an amount that dwarfed her stolen wages, back pay, penalties, and punitive damages that would secure her family's financial future while sending a message to other companies that exploited vulnerable workers. More importantly, the settlement included systemic changes, monitored payroll systems, independent oversight of working conditions, and protections for employees who reported violations. The victory was personal for Rosa, but its implications extended far beyond her individual case. News of the settlement spread through the network of invisible workers I'd helped create, inspiring other women to document their own experiences and demand accountability from employers who'd treated them as disposable. I found myself busier in retirement than I'd been during my working years. My phone rang constantly with calls from housekeepers and office cleaners, child care workers, and food service employees who'd heard about Rosa's success and wanted guidance for their own situations. Each story followed familiar patterns: wage theft, safety violations, systematic disrespect, exploitation enabled by immigration fears and economic desperation. Emma suggested I formalize what had become my unofficial mission. "Mom, you're doing labor advocacy work already. Maybe it's time to make it official." The Martha Sullivan Workers' Justice Center opened in a modest office in Pilsen, funded by my savings and donations from women whose cases had resulted in successful settlements. We offered free consultation to workers who believed they were being exploited, help with documentation and legal processes, and connections to attorneys who specialized in labor law. But our most important service was something that couldn't be quantified in legal victories or financial settlements. We provided recognition. We listened to women whose voices had been dismissed for decades, who'd been told their experiences didn't matter, who'd learned to be grateful for scraps from tables they'd built and maintained. The center became a gathering place for invisible women throughout Chicago. They came seeking legal advice, but stayed for community, for validation, for the radical experience of being seen and heard by people who understood their struggles intimately. We held workshops on workers' rights, support groups for women dealing with employment exploitation, and informal networks that connected isolated workers across industries and neighborhoods. The work attracted national attention. Labor organizers from other cities visited to learn about our documentation strategies and community building approaches. Academic researchers wanted to study our model for connecting individual advocacy with broader systemic change. Policymakers sought input on legislation designed to strengthen protections for vulnerable workers. I testified before congressional committees about wage theft and workplace exploitation, sharing not just statistics but stories. Rosa's case, my own experience at Winton Financial, the dozens of women who'd found their voices through our center. The personal became political, individual transformation contributed to collective action, and invisible workers began to gain visibility in policy discussions that had previously ignored their existence. Emma, now established in her EPA career, took pride in watching her mother's transformation from victim to advocate to national voice for workplace justice. She often introduced me at conferences and events not as my mother, the former janitor, but as my mother, the labor advocate who's changing how America treats its most vulnerable workers. The description felt accurate but incomplete. I was changing how America treated vulnerable workers, but more fundamentally, I was helping vulnerable workers change how they saw themselves. The shift from gratitude to expectation, from invisibility to presence, from individual suffering to collective action, these weren't just policy changes, but psychological revolutions that began in the hearts and minds of women who'd spent decades apologizing for existing. 5 years after opening the center, we'd handled over 300 cases with a success rate that amazed even the attorneys who worked with us. But success meant different things to different women. For some, like Rosa, it meant substantial financial settlements and systematic changes in working conditions. For others, success meant simply finding the courage to ask for a raise, to report safety violations, to expect basic respect from supervisors who treated them as invisible. The center's success attracted attention from unexpected sources. Richard Winton called one afternoon, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone who'd learned to navigate relationships built on mutual respect rather than power differentials. He wanted to make a donation to our work, he said, as a way of acknowledging the importance of what we were doing. I was tempted to refuse. My pride still carried scars from decades of humiliation at his hands. But Emma reminded me that justice sometimes meant accepting help from former opponents, that transformation should include the possibility of redemption for people who'd learned to do better. The Winton Foundation became one of our major funders, supporting not just individual casework but broader research into employment practices and worker protections. Richard and I developed a professional relationship built on shared commitment to workplace justice rather than personal affection or forgiveness. He'd never fully apologized for his treatment of me, but his financial support for other vulnerable workers served as a form of amends that had practical value beyond emotional satisfaction. The center's work expanded to include policy advocacy. We pushed for stronger enforcement of existing labor laws, broader protections for workers who reported violations, and systemic changes that would prevent the kinds of exploitation we saw daily. Our success stories became case studies in legislative hearings, evidence that investment in worker protections generated economic benefits that extended far beyond individual employees. One particularly meaningful victory involved legislation that required companies to provide detailed pay stubs and maintain transparent timekeeping systems, reforms that would prevent the wage theft that had affected Rosa and countless other women. The bill passed with bipartisan support, fueled by testimony from workers who'd found their voices through our advocacy efforts. But perhaps the most profound change was cultural rather than legal. The network of invisible women we'd helped create had evolved into a movement that crossed ethnic and racial lines, connected workers across industries and neighborhoods, and challenged the assumption that economic desperation made exploitation inevitable. Women who'd once apologized for asking to be treated fairly now demanded respect as a basic right. Employees who'd once accepted abuse because they needed jobs now understood that needing work didn't require accepting mistreatment. The psychological transformation was as important as the legal victories, perhaps more so. Emma's research on environmental justice had evolved to include workplace conditions, examining how the same communities that faced environmental hazards also experienced employment exploitation. Her work connected my labor advocacy with broader questions of social justice, demonstrating how various forms of inequality reinforced each other in ways that affected entire families and communities. At a conference where we were both speakers, she presenting research on environmental racism, me discussing labor advocacy. I watched my daughter command attention from academics and policymakers with the same confidence she'd shown as a child, but now amplified by expertise and purpose. The girl who'd grown up watching her mother be invisible had become a woman whose voice carried weight in rooms where important decisions were made. During the question and answer session, someone asked about the relationship between our work, about how environmental and labor justice connected. Emma looked at me before answering, and I saw in her expression not just professional respect, but personal pride. My mother taught me that justice isn't abstract, she said. It's personal. It's about specific people in specific situations who deserve dignity and respect. Whether we're talking about toxic exposure or wage theft, the underlying principle is the same. Everyone deserves to be treated as fully human, regardless of their economic status or position in someone else's hierarchy. The audience applauded, but I felt the deeper significance of her words. The daughter who'd learned independence out of necessity had grown into someone who understood interdependence as strength, who saw individual stories as part of larger patterns that required collective action to change. On the 10th anniversary of my confrontation with Richard Winton, the center hosted a celebration that drew hundreds of women whose lives had been touched by our work. Former clients who'd won settlements spoke about how legal victories had changed their families' circumstances. Current clients shared stories of finding courage to speak up, of discovering that their experiences mattered, of learning to expect fairness rather than just hope for it. Rosa, now a community organizer herself, introduced me as the woman who taught me that being grateful and being exploited aren't the same thing. Her words captured something essential about the transformation we'd all experienced, the shift from defensive gratitude to assertive expectation, from individual suffering to collective action. The celebration included awards for allies who'd supported our work, attorneys who'd taken cases on contingency, journalists who'd covered our stories, politicians who'd championed worker protection legislation. Richard Winton received recognition for his foundation's support, and when he approached the podium, I wondered what he would say about our complicated history. 10 years ago, he began, Martha Sullivan taught me something I should have learned much earlier in life, that everyone in an organization contributes to its success, and everyone deserves recognition for that contribution. The work she does now helps other employers learn that lesson without experiencing the kind of confrontation that was necessary to get my attention. It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was acknowledgement. More importantly, it was a public recognition that my work had value, that the invisible woman he'd once dismissed had become someone whose expertise commanded respect. The irony of receiving praise from my former tormentor was rich, but the validation was meaningful regardless of its source. The evening's keynote speaker was a federal official who'd worked on labor policy for 3 decades. She spoke about systemic changes in how government agencies investigated workplace violations, how documentation techniques pioneered by our center had become standard practices in labor enforcement, how individual stories of exploitation had contributed to broader understanding of economic inequality. The Martha Sullivan Workers' Justice Center represents something revolutionary, she said, not just because it helps individual workers seek justice, but because it demonstrates that those workers are themselves experts on workplace conditions, that their experiences provide essential data for policy making, that their voices belong in conversations about economic justice. As I listened to her speech, I reflected on the distance I'd traveled from, that night when I'd sat in Richard Winton's chair, staring at investment statements that revealed the gap between his wealth and my desperation. The angry, exhausted woman who'd photographed those documents couldn't have imagined that her act of desperate documentation would evolve into a systematic approach to workplace advocacy that helped hundreds of other women find their voices. The celebration ended with commitments rather than congratulations. Women pledged to continue organizing in their workplaces, to support co-workers facing exploitation, to vote for candidates who prioritized worker protection policies. The personal had become political, individual transformation had contributed to collective action, and invisible workers had gained visibility that could generate lasting change. Emma found me after the event, as I was gathering flowers and awards and the accumulated debris of public recognition. She helped me load everything into my car, the same compact sedan I'd bought with my first raise from Winton Financial, still running reliably after years of faithful service. "I'm proud of you, Mom," she said as we drove through downtown Chicago toward my apartment. "Not just tonight, but everything. The way you fought for yourself, the way you fought for other people, the way you turned your own pain into other people's liberation." Her words meant everything to me. More than the awards, more than the public recognition, more than the policy changes we'd achieved. Emma's respect validated not just my work, but the choices I'd made, the risks I'd taken, the transformation from grateful victim to assertive advocate. At home that night, I sat by my window overlooking the city, surrounded by flowers from the celebration and photos documenting a decade of advocacy work. The Winton Financial Tower was visible in the distance, lit up against the dark sky like a monument to the concentration of wealth that still characterized American capitalism. But the building no longer dominated the view from my window. Other towers had risen nearby, office buildings and residential complexes that housed thousands of people whose stories I'd never hear, whose struggles I'd never witness, whose victories I'd never celebrate. The city was larger than any single building, more complex than any individual story of exploitation or liberation. My phone rang. It always rang in the evenings, women calling after work shifts, during breaks, whenever they could find privacy to discuss problems they'd been carrying alone. This caller was young, her accent suggesting recent immigration, her voice shaking with the combination of fear and hope that I'd learned to recognize. "Mrs. Sullivan, my name is Carmen. I heard about your center from Rosa Mendoza. I work in a hotel downtown, and I think they're cheating us on our pay. But I don't know what to do, and I'm scared if I complain, they'll fire me." I settled back in my chair, ready to listen, ready to help another woman discover that her voice had power, that her experience mattered, that dignity was a right worth fighting for. Outside my window, the city sparkled with lights from buildings where invisible people were making everything else possible. But increasingly, they weren't staying invisible. The story was far from over. In fact, it was still beginning, one conversation at a time, one woman at a time, one act of courage building on the last until the accumulation of individual transformations created collective change that no one could ignore. "Carmen," I said, reaching for the notebook where I documented every call, every story, every step in the long journey toward justice. "Tell me what's happening. Start from the beginning, and don't leave anything out. Your story matters, and we're going to figure out how to make sure you're treated fairly." As she began to speak, I thought about all the women who'd made similar calls, all the stories that had contributed to the movement we'd built together, all the victories that had proved that invisibility was a choice that could be rejected. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new cases, new opportunities to help vulnerable workers discover their own power. But tonight, there was just Carmen's voice in my ear, another woman ready to stop being grateful for less than she deserved, another invisible worker preparing to claim her rightful place in the American promise of dignity and justice for all. The conversation continued, and outside my window, the city glittered with possibility. Have you ever felt invisible in your own workplace, watching others receive credit for your contributions? Have you seen someone you love sacrifice their dignity for financial security, staying silent in the face of disrespect because they needed the job? Share your experience in the comments. Your story matters, and someone needs to hear that they're not alone. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe. These stories reach people who need to know that their voices have power, that their experience has value, that dignity is a right worth fighting for. To continue these emotional journeys, we've created a special podcast with equally powerful stories. You can find it right here on the left. Thank you for being part of this journey toward visibility and justice. I'll see you in the next story.